Go to ChatGPT and say, hi, can you check this email to my ex-wife, my ex-husband? I need to check it for tone, length and flow. And ChatGPT will come back and say, well done. It's a really good attempt. However, I recommend the following. And it will say, for example, the way you say you could be seen as provocative. Getting your communication seen by a second pair of eyes and or robot in the sky can be a really positive way of diffusing the kind of misunderstandings and conflict that come from bad communication. If you are writing emails to your ex-partner, I guarantee you they're looking hostile. So I've had some bad days over the years. I've lost people very close to me. I've had bereavements. I've had funerals. I've lost jobs. I've lost careers. I've had some really rubbish things, and none of them come close to trying to explain to young children what it means that mummy and daddy are no longer going to be married and living in the same house. Nothing comes close to it. My children kind of knew before the big announcement.
Because they'd overheard you?
They just had a strong sense, and I think information was getting out when it shouldn't. And by the time there was the moment, and I'll always remember the moment, I think they knew what was coming. But that didn't make it any easier. And actually, you forget at the time, you look at your children and you think, oh, they're quite grown up, they're quite sensible, they're intelligent, they're tiny kids. And even if you're dealing with like a 9-year-old, or in my case, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, this is their world falling apart. Because what I realized at the time is that for my children, if you cut them in half, they're half mum, half dad. You're literally their world. So the point at which you say, we're no longer together, now when I look back, I realize to them that sounded like basically mum and dad don't love you anymore. You're bad people, because if we can't be together, then it reflects on you as children. It is such a minefield.
And when it came to the legality around the separation itself, how did you handle that?
Again, I would say badly, but I think we've all been brought up around the EastEnders moment, and you think that divorce is a moment when lawyers have to be involved, and you're immediately going down that adversarial route. But once you press that button, you're in the process, you're in the system.
So did it even get to the stage where you were talking to each other only via lawyers?
It was pretty quickly the lawyers that were talking to each other.
And I suppose that's under the guise of actually that being easier, right? They do it so you don't have to have that conversation. But I know from dealing with lawyers on things that aren't personal, they accelerate things very quickly by writing each other shitty letters.
They accelerate, they escalate. I mean, there are lots of very lovely lawyers, but ultimately a lawyer is there to defend the interest.
To staunchly put your case.
Yeah.
More staunchly than you might.
Exactly. Whatever your case is, they will hold that line. They're not really there to make sure that you kind of find a way forward. Because the most important thing is you just need calm voices saying, right, this is happening, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to get out.
How bad did it get?
I would say about as bad as it can get in terms of the stress and in terms of the sort of adversarial nature of it. I don't think it could have been any worse for my children. A divorce is really hard to unravel. I had in my head this image of a bowl of spaghetti. It's really stayed with me. And it was like, this is a big bowl of spaghetti, and somehow I've got to unravel all of these strands. Because think about everything that's involved, like children, money, house, life. Obviously, both of us wanted to spend time with the children. Both of us wanted to have good relationships with our children. But you've no longer got that ability to do it under the same roof. Yeah. It's a really tricky question.
Does it sort of feel like starting again then when you are spending time with kids? Because you build up that relationship on the basis that they live with you and you have a life together.
I remember clearly waking up one morning thinking everything that's gone before is erased. Because the relationship that, as you rightly say, you have with your children is based on mum and dad. Of a weekend, this, you've got young children, of a weekend, you kind of do that Trumpton thing where you take turns, one steps forward, one steps back, and of an evening, one might make supper, one might do bedtime. I mean, that's a fairly normal functioning marriage. When you then become in effect, a solo parent, you're then learning new stuff. And I remember sort of having to reshape my identity as a dad because I was doing things that I wasn't necessarily doing previously. And I'm absolutely sure that my children's mum had the same thing because we each had to stop to do things we weren't previously doing. And that is a really scary place to be.
And the classic thing people always say, I don't know if you had experience of this, is that then when it's your time with the kids, you do all the things you wouldn't have done when there were two of you. There's more sugar, there's more treats, there's more dad's the best one.
We have the term McDonald's dad for a reason. It is a thing. I mean, I'll tell you a story. It was about 3 or 4 months after my marriage ended, and I wanted to take the kids away. I thought it'd be a nice idea. Let's go away for the weekend. And I had the idea to hire a mobile home. Like a what do they call them in America? The big
Winnebago.
Winnebago. Sorry. And so I hired this thing, and I had no idea how big it was. And I basically had arranged for the children to come to, at the time, my parents' house to be dropped off so we could go away. And this thing was so long that it didn't fit at the end of the cul-de-sac where my parents live. and I just,
Black Sabbath's tour bus kind of thing.
It was literally that. And no one had warned me of this. I mean, it was a 4-berth thing, but it had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. And I just remember parking this thing up and watching my children arrive and actually thinking, I look a bit of an idiot, because I was stood next to this huge thing, which was so out of character. And in my head, I'd had like, let's go on a little mobile home, you know? And I just remember thinking, this is over the top. It's a period of very great insecurity. You're worried what your children are thinking about you and thinking about the situation. So you do rather naturally get into that process of trying to be the absolute best you can, but trying way too hard. And actually you forget that prior to that, the kids were quite happy to do nothing of a weekend, and that was a nice weekend, and you might do a bit of play there, and that was the extent of the entertainment.
And even after you've kind of moved on, as it were, you know, you're living separate lives, you've worked out who has the kids when, is it still there in the back of your mind that there's this thing that's fragmented?
The thing that I underestimated at the time, and I think is really easy to underestimate, is that your children are not then frozen in time. So what you work out when your children are X, Y, and Z of age is going to be very different when they're X, X, Y, Y, and Z, Z, which, by the way, as you know, Olly, is probably tomorrow or next week. So the children are changing constantly, and therefore the nature of the arrangements and the nature of your relationships changes constantly as well. And in a way, I just remember feeling it was even more acute than if I was still in the same house as children. But, and this is a big but, if I have one sort of regret, and I've got a lot of regrets, but if I have one regret thinking back, it was constantly seeing things through the prism of divorce. Because I remember that stuff would happen and I would think, well, that's because the marriage broken up. And that's because, and actually you forget that children can be really hard work. They have their moments, stuff happens, and it may just be because they're being children and not because of what they've gone through. One of the hardest things that I found was managing personal stress and personal life while having a public facing job. And I don't think that was any different for me as a broadcaster than someone who's a teacher going through a divorce, someone who's a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer. It was really hard at times going on air at the peak of stress. Sometimes having to deal with lawyer stuff at 5 to 12 and then at 12:03, hi and welcome to the radio. Although there's a case saying that's the best thing you can do, because once your mic's live, that's it's the same as you're a teacher. You go into your classroom, that's all you can focus on at that moment. But it was an incredibly stressful period, because they say the hardest thing is divorce, then job problems, marriage. I mean, it was all happening at the same time.
Because you'd look down at your phone and there'd be an email from a lawyer. I mean, if you don't read it, you just see the preview, don't you? And that's in your brain then.
And that, by the way, is one of the hardest things. It is the notifications. So every time you receive an email from a lawyer or anyone involved in the process, it is literally like someone's ripped your heart out for that split second, and you kind of become really sensitized to it, and then you get really stressed, and then you don't look at it for an hour or a day. And if you're trying to hold down a job at the same time, which I was, it's very, very challenging indeed.
And it costs money. I mean, lawyers cost money. So if you're still going through that process at the time that you then realise you're not going to have the income stream you thought you had, that's extra impactful. And
it's interesting how it all ties in, because ultimately divorce is a time of massive change. And I think it's not by chance that there was also massive change professionally as well, because the person that I was when I became a broadcaster was not the person I was when I left the BBC. And a big part of that was because of my own personal circumstances. And I think they really colour what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in a position where I could visibly make a difference. So I retrained as a family mediator.
What is a family mediator, and how's that different to the route that you went down?
Totally different. And a family mediator is an impartial person or people, because it can be co-mediators, who help a separating or divorcing couple to separate and divorce better. A family mediator does not advise. We're not there to dispense legal advice, although we often talk in terms of working in the shadow of the law. So we know what the law is, and we know that we can't send you away with proposals that wouldn't stand up if you then took them to a judge to sign off. But a family mediator is there to enable both of you to be heard, both of you to feel in a balanced environment, to feel empowered to make your own decisions. Ultimately, these are your children. You know them better than anyone. You know what's best for them. Ultimately, it's your money. It's great that you can still have a say in what happens to your money, rather than potentially someone saying, this is what will happen to your money.
So it's sort of like a doula for divorce.
I think that's actually a pretty good approach. I was driven and remain driven by an absolutely insatiable desire to make a difference to children's experience of divorce. I've made my mistakes to try and help other people not make the same mistakes. So you can be working with a couple who start in a place, and then by the time they've done 3 or 4 or 5 sessions, you can visibly see the difference.
Okay, so are they both in the room with you then, the divorcing couple, when you're mediating?
People have an initial meeting. It's rather grandly called a MIAM, a mediation information assessment meeting. But what it is, it's a one-to-one meeting where they get a chance to just tell their story. And
individually to you?
Individually and confidentially.
Right.
And it is an incredibly intimate moment, because it is fair to say that anyone coming to their, you can call it intake meeting, their initial meeting, their MIAM, is in a very difficult place. And as a mediator, it's a very privileged moment because you're helping them tell that story. Because mediation is voluntary. You can't force anyone to mediate. And if the will is there, and if they both want to progress, then they progress to mediation. And they can progress to joint sessions, which, you know, they can be in the same space, they can be in separate rooms, and we can shuttle between them.
Okay. Just through human nature, it strikes me, even though you're a professional and you've trained in it, the he said, she said thing, once you've heard one side of the story, it must be harder when you hear the second person to not be filling in the blanks.
It is a real challenge to remain open-minded. I sometimes use the analogy of a W. So I'm sat opposite you right now, Olly, and I could draw a W on this table, but to you it looks like an M, and it's exactly the same letter. So you basically could be telling me exactly the same story. It sounds radically different, but you're both looking at the same story.
In general, do they tell radically different stories?
I think the core is always there, so that the core facts are always there. I think the most important thing, and in some ways the hardest thing in that moment, is for them to feel heard. So it's not the role of the mediator to be thinking whether what they're saying is true or not, or right or not. It's certainly not our role to judge. It's their story, and it's what I used to do on the radio. It's tell me your story and give them the chance to be heard.
Okay, but if you're not judging it, as it were, what is the purpose of listening to it? What do you do with that once you've heard it? Primarily,
we're assessing whether mediation is appropriate, and safeguarding is a really important element of mediation. So if we have concerns for the safeguarding of a vulnerable adult, if we have concerns around the safeguarding for a child, and also if we have concerns, for example, around financial criminality, if we reveal that I don't know, someone's robbed a bank and the £1 million in the bank account have come from criminal gain, we don't really want to be involved with that. So what we're doing is we're explaining the process, and we're assessing whether it is appropriate to move to mediation. Divorce isn't about blame anymore. So back in the day, you'd say, "Oh, I'm divorcing because they had an affair."
Yeah, you actually literally had to say that, didn't you, legally?
You had to tick a box. That's no longer the case. So all of the, to use your line, he said, she said, is not entirely relevant, because when it then comes to mediation, we unapologetically, unreservedly, unashamedly keep it focused on the children. So all of the they did this and they did that, they go out the window a little bit, because we'll always come back to, okay, but what's best for Johnny and Jane here?
Is it easier for men to relate to you because you're a man?
I think that one of the motivating factors of becoming a mediator is that the system in its broadest sense is quite female dominated. I think something like 85% of mediators are women. The sort of professional systems around children are dominated by women.
It's a sort of classic male divorcee letter that we receive on this show as well.
Yeah.
Is I had a divorce and the system was biased against me.
Yeah.
It's a common trope that men feel, isn't it?
You'll have men tell you that they would be part of, for example, a children's services meeting, and they would have been one man in a room with 10 women. And that's a fact. That happens. By the time you add in perhaps the head teacher of a primary school, who are statistically more often going to be a woman. So it is really hard being a man / a dad in the system. It's challenging as a mediator because I absolutely want clients to identify with me, but equally I can't afford for them to think that I'm siding with them. I share with clients, mums and dads, that I'm a parent. I'm happy to share that. I share with them that I've had a tricky divorce. Again, I'm happy to share that. I think where being a man really helps, really helps, is around something called co-mediation. When I became a mediator, I was a broadcaster, Olly. Come on, I was a solo. I do things on my own because I'm a radio presenter. And I remember thinking, I don't think I'll do co-mediation. I won't need someone else. And actually, co-mediation is amazing because you have two mediators in a room with the divorcing couple. Where it's really interesting to have one of those co-mediators being male is around dynamic in the room, and it creates a balance for the couple. There's a modelling aspect there as well, because the mediators are interacting with each other, and you're kind of modelling what good communication actually looks like.
Again, thinking back to our mailbag, I can imagine a scenario where it's uncomfortable for a woman to talk to you in particular. Obviously, it happens to men too, but it happens more frequently to women, is when they've been the victim of domestic violence. How's that when you're talking to a woman by herself about that experience? You
just hit on possibly one of the most important questions that we face as a profession. I mentioned the assessment part of the MIAM and the screening part of the MIAM, and a big part of that is around domestic abuse. And we have to be really direct in our questions. We have to ascertain whether there has been domestic abuse, violence, controlling and coercive behaviour, and we have to ask those questions. I personally haven't experienced women feeling less comfortable in opening up to me because I guess I am quite naturally soft and sensitive, and I can ask those questions in a non-threatening way. But those questions absolutely have to be asked. Now, what's quite interesting around domestic abuse is that even up to a year or 2 years ago, the mere presence of domestic abuse was enough to say that the situation can't be mediated. And actually, there were new guidelines brought in a year ago where the family court ideally doesn't want to see people. Family court is great in certain contexts, but ideally they want you to sort it out. They think you know your children best. They think it's your money and you know best what to do with it. And so they will hope that you will try an out-of-court way, of which mediation is one of them. It's what they call non-court dispute resolution. And one of the things they've done there is they've raised the bar a little bit, the threshold. It doesn't mean that they're going to put anyone in an unsafe situation, but the mere fact of saying there was domestic abuse is no longer enough in and of itself to not mediate. And one of the things that I've noticed as well, sometimes it's actually in the long term safer to help people come out of those marriages than to not. So although it may be an extremely complex situation, a year down the line, where if you've helped facilitate that separation, that person may actually ultimately be safer. There must have been occasions without identifying people where you've sat there and thought, this guy's an arsehole, I'm glad they're getting divorced. I'll be really honest with you. I'm constantly having opinions in my head. What's really fascinated me is how those opinions can actually change from 1 minute to the next. I've sat with people and I'm thinking, that's really bad. And then 5 minutes later, I'm thinking, okay, that's also really bad. And it is, in some ways, the hardest thing of being a mediator is we have to be humane, but we have to sort of tone down that human side of us that actually is formulating opinions of the people who are in front of us. We have to just remember that we're here to help these people separate. And there is I'm quite fascinated by systemic family theory. And if you ask family therapists what they think of people, they will say that their belief is that no one is fundamentally evil, that we're all results of our environment and the systems we were brought up in and the generational systems we were brought up in. And therefore, even if someone is, presenting as really difficult, you have to come from that position of we've got to help them get through this and separate well.
And some of them presumably don't want to be there. If the laws change so that they sort of have to do it on the step to going to court, so they don't have to pay more when they get to court, they don't want to be there.
There's a very grey area where if the court is saying go to mediation, is it still voluntary?
Yeah, right.
And that is a grey area. We're seeing more and more courts sending back couples who've been in and out of court for 2 or 3 years.
What's that like? What's the atmosphere like in that room compared to the couple who've just come to you because, you know, they're thinking about separating and they're concerned for the children? It's a very different scenario, isn't it?
It's a very different scenario, and it's a very excellent question. I think that what happens is that the court process and the adversarial legal process can institutionalize people. You might see a couple who have been in and out of court for a long time, and sometimes, by the way, having spent eye-watering sums of money. Eye-watering.
Go on, give us a figure.
It is very easy in court to spend £15,000 or £20,000, and before you know it, you can be spending £80,000, £90,000. By that point, you know they've been in court because a lot of the language is very adversarial, and they'll be talking in terms of custody and contact, and it's my right. And if you're in the court system that long, you kind of stop talking about your children like they're children.
Yeah.
One of the big roles as mediators that we have is shifting that language a bit. So, for example, you would never hear me talk about custody or contact.
Why?
Because they're your children. So it's not about when you can contact them. It's about when they spend time with you. If you start to shift that linguistic narrative a little bit, you focus back on the children.
By the way, on that, whatever you call it, at the end of the day, what you're coming to in a settlement is presumably a timetable. Monday to Wednesday here, Thursday to Sunday there, or whatever. And so that there are days of the week and how they're attributed and all the rest of it. How do you actually urge people towards a particular outcome on that? Because it actually then isn't legally binding, is it? It's just a decision between them.
Okay, you may not be aware, but you've actually asked me 4 questions there. So the first thing is that, I don't know about you, but since about the age of 2, if someone tells me to do something, there is a lot less likelihood of me sticking to it than if I've had agency in that decision. Mediation is different to court because you're coming to proposals yourselves as opposed to a court saying this is what's going to happen. And there is a lot of anecdotal and indeed statistical evidence that arrangements reached through mediation are stuck to better because both people had a say in those decisions. You can then, for example, with arrangements for your children, go and get that enshrined in a court order.
Can you? So you do mediation,
yep.
Agree on a thing,
yep.
And then a court order that's a lot cheaper and a lot less adversarial. It's
you go to court
formalising
and say, look, we've got this. It's called a memorandum of understanding. This is what we've agreed. Can we put this in a court order? The wider question, this is where I'm going to bring a little bit of my own personal experience in here, is that what you agree on Monday is likely to change on Tuesday because children. And it is, I think, one of the most important points to think about when you are going through a separation, that what feels right today for your children likely will change tomorrow or when they change schools. What you're discussing at that point, and I'll use the term fighting about at that point, may not still be relevant in a year's time. So, for example, you may have 3-year-old twins and they're not at school. And so you're talking about how you will arrange their time. And within a year, they're going to be at school and everything changes. And it is very, very easy to get very focused on numbers. In 10 years' time, they won't remember whether they did supper on a Tuesday with you. They won't remember whether the alternate Friday was their mum day or their dad day. They'll remember how mum and dad worked it out. All children experience divorce differently. I have a total of 6 children, 3 of whom I own, I made, and 3 of whom I've inherited along the way.
In a new relationship.
In a new relationship. And I can tell you that all 6 children have been through a divorce, and every single one of them has a different way of managing their time with their parents. Every single one of them. So you're right. Ultimately, you are, coming to a plan, and particularly in situations where there's high conflict, which are both challenging, but also, dare I use the term, as a mediator, quite, in inverted commas, enjoyable, because you want to move people away from that high conflict. Yes, of course, you will find extended discussions around, but if I do the pickup at 11 o'clock, I'm not getting 50-50 if I do it at midday. I mean, these discussions do happen. And it's about shifting away from viewing the children as
something you own. Yeah, that does sound like cattle, the way you just put that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And looking at what works for the children. We have something called child inclusive mediation. We'll start more or less at a certain age, 9, 10. There's no fixed rule, but there's a point at which it's easier to involve the children. It's a balancing act because some parents rightly feel that enough's going on for their children already than having to speak to a trained child inclusive mediator. Where it's really powerful is what the children say is not going to be binding. So you're not going to say to the parents, well, Johnny says, I don't want to see dad. Because often the concern is you might have a mum that will say, oh, if you speak to Charlotte, she's going to tell you all of this because her dad's told her to say that, or vice versa.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's about allowing the children to feel they're heard and to feel part of the process, and then relaying that back to the parents in a way that can't cause any harm to the children, but giving them that voice. It doesn't mean that you're going to absolutely follow what they've said. Child inclusive mediation is about giving children a sense of agency in the process, and it can sometimes be a real shift moment. So if, for example, you've got parents who are very stuck around times, who are very stuck around, I want this amount and I want that amount. Sometimes you might have a child that says, I don't really care if I only see mum on it. And that can be very powerful.
How do you unlock the sticking points? When there really is just no obvious compromise between two views, but they want to compromise. What's the magic words?
Sometimes you have to be really blunt. So you could, for example, have a situation where you've got two parents who are very entrenched, and there's a lot of I want. And that's very common. And I might say something like, I'm going to be really honest to both of you. I've got no sense of Johnny and Charlotte in the room right now. I'm hearing both of you, but where are your kids? Because all I'm hearing is, and that can be a very salutary moment, reminding them that the kids are part of the process. Sometimes as well, you can, again, it's this line between personal and private. Sometimes someone will say to me, and what do you know? Which is, it's like, okay, well, let me tell you what I know. I'm here for a reason, and this is what I know. And that can be quite a salutary moment as well, where you actually, on a human level, say, look, I know the impact that this could be having on your children, and these are your options. And also, just, you mentioned finances and cost earlier on. There is a very prosaic financial element to this. If, say, you've got two people who are trying to work out what to do with their finances. So there's a house and there's a certain amount of equity in it. And let's say that in their pot, there's a total of, I'll take a random figure, £250,000. And they're fighting. And then you say, this is fine. You're welcome to take this to a court where you'll be told what to do with your money. And that will cost you each a minimum of £15,000. There's an absolute commercial decision to make at that point. Yeah. Like, we're going to spend money which will cost more than what we're actually fighting over. And it is that sort of reality check moment. And there is something really important as well to bear in mind. And that is to never judge the importance of someone's money relative to someone else's. Sometimes the most difficult things to resolve are where there's the least amount of money at play. It can be very, very hard where you're looking at how to distribute £10,000 compared to how to distribute 5 million.
Yeah.
Where you're dealing with a situation where funds are so tight, it can be very, very challenging.
Okay, so is there such a thing as a good divorce? And if there is, how do you go about doing it?
There absolutely is. And my favourite kind of case, for want of a better phrase, is where two people get in touch and say, we've decided to separate. We haven't told the children yet. We need to work this through. And I have been known to literally practice a script as to how to tell the children. And I've done it by exploring what they want to say, and I've made them repeat it over and over again until they're ready to do so and they agree a time to do so. And they put in place certain things so that by the time they tell the children, okay, mummy and daddy, we are breaking up, but we've agreed this. This is what's going to happen next. We're working together for you. The difference that makes is unquantifiable in terms of the experience for the children. It's a noble aim to have an amicable divorce, and it is often very hard. If, for example, someone's had an affair, well, it's very hard to get beyond those feelings at that moment in time. But ultimately, you chose to have the children didn't choose to have you, and you're choosing to divorce, and the children haven't chosen that either. And the good divorce comes when both parents remain the adults, and really importantly, allow the children to remain children. So this is quite a key point, because what we'll often hear is, oh, little David, I know he's 7, but he's so grown up. He's so grown up. And, I talked to him about it, and he's not grown up. He's 7. And we have a term parentifying, where you sort of give young children a parental role, an adult role. Keeping children, letting them be children is the key.
And that sometimes means, doesn't it, actually internalising some of the things you want to say about your partner or your ex-partner. I'm thinking about a friend of mine who's recently going through this, whose wife cheated on him, and he hasn't told the children that. So the children think they've equally come to a decision to separate, but actually in his mind this is very clearly, she cheated on me, she was having an affair for a long time, we had to divorce, I've now got the children. But I'm never going to tell them that, because that's going to ruin their childhood. That's like a sacrifice you're making, isn't it? Mentally.
That's a really adult thing to do, and it's the best thing for the children. We have adult concepts around blame and behaviour. I mean, I don't even think a 6-year-old would understand what an affair is.
Right, yeah.
And you have to accept that no matter how bad one or other of the people is, you're both responsible in some way or other for the end of the marriage. You've both been married, and you've both got your parts of that process that have led to the end of it. And what you have to remember is, as soon as you attribute criticism or blame of your ex-partner, you're actually criticising the child. So if you say to your child, your dad has done that, your mum was that, what the child is hearing is, I'm bad. And as soon as they hear that, that's when you start to affect their outcomes and their mental health, and the impact can be devastating.
The thing that keeps coming up the whole way through this conversation is you keep talking about communication.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because you are and were a communicator first, and that's the thing that you're interested in, but I just keep hearing you say that word. And I'm just wondering, as sort of general advice for people in marriages or thinking about separating, whether that really, in one word, is the key?
So I can't advise when you're in a marriage, because that's for marriage guidance counsellors, but I can advise when you're coming out of the marriage. And it was a very trusted colleague and friend of mine who said that communication is often the cause of the breakup, and it's also often the solution to make the breakup work okay. And when a marriage ends, everything goes out the window. Trust goes out the window. I dare say sort of adult behaviour sometimes goes out the window. It's quite easy to descend into name calling and shouting, and it's understandable why. I would say the core of the work in mediation is setting people up so that when they come through the other side, they can interact in a way that is productive and respectful. One of my favourite tips, ChatGPT. Right?
Go on.
So if you are writing emails to your ex-partner, I guarantee you they're looking hostile. I guarantee you, even with the best will in the world. Go to ChatGPT and say, hi, I'm sending this email to my ex-husband, ex-wife. Please check it. And ChatGPT will come back and say, this is a very good effort. It's well structured. However, with a few tweaks, I can make it easier to follow and a little less hostile. And you look at ChatGPT's version and it said exactly the same things, but it's taken out the stuff which actually could be incendiary, and you haven't realised it's incendiary.
Yeah.
So if you are communicating, check the tone of what you're saying. Also, streamline the way you communicate, because what often happens in divorce is you get this explosion, and so the couple will say, oh, we're messaging via Facebook and WhatsApp and iMessage and email and phone, and the reality is, A, that's not productive, and B, that's really stressful, because they are now your ex-partners. So do you want all of your notifications flashing up from various sources? There are parenting apps. Have you heard of parenting apps?
No.
Okay, so these are brilliant. And there are a number of them. Some are paying, some aren't. There's free ones like App Close, Two Homes. There's a paying one called Our Family Wizard. They all do roughly the same thing. And what they do is they group all of your parenting into one app. So messaging, calendar, money. So for example, if you need money, instead of sending a loaded email goes, oh, you didn't pay for the school trip last time and now I've got to pay 30 quid and can you give me 15? You'll just send a little notification that says school trip 15 and the other person ticks or crosses.
Yeah, that sounds quite useful even if you're still together, to be honest.
Do you know what? I've recommended it to people who are still together as well. It creates a parenting hub, and also it takes away the invasiveness of potentially your interactions with your ex-partner. So what a lot of people will do is they'll agree that they will look at Our Family Wizard or App Close once a day. There are very, very few examples where you need an immediate reply. Very few. So you'll say, look, we'll message, and I promise every night at 7 o'clock I'll just check in and I will reply within 24 hours. So instead of notifications flashing up in your WhatsApp all day, which can happen, you're just containing it. And there are other advantages to those parenting apps, which are that if it does go to court, the court will accept the communications in those parenting apps as being trustworthy.
Do you still believe in marriage?
I tell you what I do believe in. I believe that if you are married, talk about this stuff while you're happily married. Explore what you would do if you got divorced. What are your views on parenting?
I don't know how to introduce that topic over dinner, really.
Hi, can we talk about divorce? Talk about your finances. What's important to us? Personally, if you ask me, Nick, do you believe in marriage? I think there's a case for marriage being a 10-year license, and then reviewed after 10 years. It will never happen. But
break clause.
I think we just have to accept that two adults being together over an extended period of time, especially when young children are involved, is really hard. And everyone takes an immediate sort of adversarial position. He was bad. She was bad. It's really hard. You've had young children. You've had finance worries. You've lost your job. The world is tough.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real case where you see people have really difficult marriages and then they move on to happy relationships because the children have grown up a bit. So marriage is really hard. But if you go into it, you've got to go into it with your eyes wide open that if it does end, you're going to have to disentangle that bowl of spaghetti.
Would you consider getting married again?
I would, yes. But if it was to happen, it would be on very different grounds, and it would be very grown up, and it would be very, this sounds horribly unromantic, but very legal. So it would be, this is where we're at, this is me, this is you, we're going to enshrine that in a cohabitation agreement or similar. And if we were to break up, then we're not going to go through the whole fights that, are easy to happen when a marriage ends. I like the theory of being married. The most important thing is how you are with your children, how your children are in that unit.